Hey everyone, today we're going to wander into a room you probably don't want to be in. A dim quiet space where the only sound is the faint ticking of a wall clock and the low creak of a chair as you shift your weight. In that stillness, you can hear your spouse speaking, and something about the tone makes the hairs on your arms rise. It's not a shout. It's not even overtly cruel, but it's colder, clipped, like frost edging a window pane on a morning you thought would be warm. You probably won't survive this emotionally. You ignore it for too long. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, I'd love to know where you are in the world right now and what time it is. Drop it in the comments. It's fun to see our little community light up across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're sitting at the kitchen table, your hands curled loosely around a mug that's gone lukewarm. Across from you, your spouse has just said something simple, but the sound of it has a different texture than it used to. It's like hearing a familiar song played in a minor key. Recognize it, but it feels wrong. The warmth that used to coat their words has thinned, replaced by an edge you can't quite file down in your mind. You tell yourself maybe they're tired. Everyone gets snappy. But then you remember it's been happening more often. Their voice now has pauses where there used to be laughter, even when they're saying pass the salt. It lands with the same energy as I'm tired of you. Experts still argue whether people's personalities truly harden with age or simply reveal what's been lurking underneath all along. Either way, you're starting to think you're hearing the unvarnished truth. The sound is not just about pitch, it's about temperature. Imagine touching a cup of tea you brewed 20 minutes ago. It's not icy, but it's not inviting anymore either. That's how their tone feels. Lukewarm in intention, yet chilling in effect. Once, they would have teased you about how you hold your fork. Now, it's a flat observation, void of the shared sparkle you once thought unshakable. A mainstream fact about aging relationships. Psychologists note that long-term couples often develop a shorthand for communication. But when trust erodes, that shorthand turns from a private joke into a private jab. And here you are, realizing the shorthand between you has shifted. The kitchen smells faintly of overripe bananas and yesterday's coffee grounds. Little too much neglect in the air. You notice they avoid your gaze now when they speak, as if eye contact might ignite a confrontation they don't want to have. Or maybe they just don't care enough to light the match. You think about the last time they called you by a pet name, and the memory feels so distant it could have been a dream you once had. Here's a quirky little real-life tidbit for you. I once read about a couple in their late 70s who communicated entirely in single-word exchanges for months. Tea, yes, walk, later. It sounds almost quaint until you realize those were the only words they traded in entire days. Their grown children had to intervene after visiting and realizing the silence between those words was heavier than any argument. Back in your own kitchen, the silence between sentences now feels exactly like that, weighted, dense, charged. You start to notice that you fill the silence with nervous chuckles, as if you're re-auditioning for the role of pleasant spouse, just to coax out the warmth you once took for granted. The strange part, sometimes the coldness isn't even triggered by a disagreement. It shows up while you're talking about mundane things, the weather, a neighbor's dog, whether the post arrived. That's when it feels the most alarming, because it suggests the problem isn't situational, it's structural. Like a crack in the foundation of a house, visible even on a sunny day. You find yourself replaying conversations in your head, long after they end, scanning for clues. Was it something you said? Or is it simply that they've shifted into a new emotional climate, and you're still wearing last season's clothes? Experts still argue whether long relationships naturally cool over time, or whether they need constant emotional tending, like a garden that will otherwise choke with weeds. The trouble is, you can't tend a garden alone and expect it to thrive. Your chair creaks again as you shift, noticing how tense your shoulders have been this whole time. You used to relax automatically around them. Now your muscles seem to brace themselves the moment you're in the same room. It's an odd physical reminder that emotional safety and physical comfort are often the same thing in a healthy relationship. When one goes, the other doesn't stick around for long. The thing about tone is that it's rarely a one-off. It's the kind of change that, once you hear it, you can't unhear it. It becomes the soundtrack to your mornings, your dinners, your bedtime conversations. And here's the quiet fear creeping in. If this is how they sound now, how will they sound in 5 years? Remember what we said about the cup of tea. Leave it long enough, and it won't just be lukewarm, it will be cold, unappetizing, maybe even moldy. Words can do the same. Left untended, a shift in tone calcifies into the new normal. And soon you're reliving in a house where every good morning feels like a formality rather than a greeting. And here's a little whispered truth that may sting. Once your ears are tuned to that coldness, you'll start to notice other signs in sync with it. The way they stand a fraction farther from you than before. The way their laughter feels more like politeness than joy. The way they never ask about your day unless prompted, and even then, their unhung is a polite exit ramp from the conversation. The kicker. You may even catch yourself mirroring their tone back at them, without meaning to. That's the danger zone, because if you start speaking in the same frostbitten cadence, the distance between you doubles in half the time. So you sit there, mug cooling in your hands, wondering if this shift is reversible, or if you're already on the slippery slope towards something you can come back from. The experts won't give you a straight answer, because they can't. All they can say is that patterns like this don't heal on their own. They require either mutual effort, or a decision to walk away before the ice becomes permanent. It's amazing how one sentence, tossed out as casually as a crumpled napkin, can lodge itself in your chest. You're clearing the dishes when your spouse sighs and says it. Not in a moment of anger, not with raised voice, but with that matter-of-fact tone, reserved for grocery lists and weather updates. You're becoming a bit of a burden. There it is. No lightning strike, no crashing cymbals, just a quiet rearranging of the air between you. The fork in your hand feels heavier, and for a second, you can't tell if your breath has actually stopped, or if it just feels that way. A mainstream fact about elderly life. Studies show that the perception of being a burden is one of the strongest predictors of depression in older adults. It's not just a feeling, it's a mental trap that can quietly erode your health. And when your life partner is the one setting that trap, you can't exactly pretend it's just a random twig in your path. You glance over at them, searching for a flicker of remorse, or even awareness. Instead, they're stacking plates like they've just said something about the soup being too salty. That nonchalance stings more than if they'd shouted. At least shouting comes from a place of heat. This is cold air seeping in through a gap you didn't know was in the wall. Experts still argue whether remarks like this come from genuine frustration, creeping resentment, or inherited attitudes about aging from their own families. But whatever the source, the outcome is predictable. You start to shrink. Not physically, but in presence. You speak less. You ask for less. You move around the house like you're trying not to take up space. And here's a quirky, real-world tidbit for you. There was a woman named Edith in her late 70s, whose husband started introducing her at parties as my little project. People laughed. Edith smiled politely. But over time, she noticed he stopped inviting her to some events entirely, claiming it would be too much for her. The project label had become a quiet cage. Edith's escape came in the form of joining a seniors hiking group. Her husband's reaction: "Don't overdo it." She went anyway, and on those trails, she realized how small she'd let herself become at home. Back in your kitchen, the room feels suddenly foreign. You can hear the hum of the fridge, the clink of cutlery, the low shuffle of their slippers. Everything sounds louder, as if to fill the silence where your sense of safety used to live. You start thinking about the last time they asked how you were, without following it up with some variation of, "but you can't remember." The problem with the burden remark is how it echoes. Once it's out there, it hovers, invisible but constant. Every time you need help opening a jar, every time you ask for a ride to an appointment, every time you take an extra moment to get up from the chair, you will hear that word again. You'll start editing yourself, avoiding those requests, telling yourself it's to keep the peace, when really, it's because you don't want to confirm their narrative. Experts still argue whether relationships at this stage can be rewired to remove such poisonous framing. Some say yes, if both people are willing to unlearn years of subtle jabs. Others insist that once a partner sees you as a weight, it's only a matter of time before they start measuring whether you're worth carrying at all. You rinse a plate, watching the water spiral down the drain. And the motion feels uncomfortably familiar, like you, swirling slowly toward the edges of this shared life. And here's the part you don't say out loud. You've been the one carrying them before. Through illness, through job loss, through those months when they couldn't get out of bed after losing someone close. You didn't think of them as a burden then. You thought of them as yours. That's the difference. When love is intact, help isn't heavy, it's shared weight, a mutual leaning that feels like stability. When love starts to sour, every ounce is measured, and the scale is tipped against you. You dry your hands, listening to their voice in the other room, and realize that burden is just the polite version. There are harsher words behind it, words they haven't said yet, but you can feel circling. If you wait long enough, they'll land. And by then, you might already believe them. You notice it creeping in like a slow leak. Money, once the shared glue of your life together, begins to feel like a leash. The shift is subtle at first. They start questioning purchases they never used to bat an eye at. A paperback novel. Do you really need more books? A lunch with an old friend. That's a bit much for just a sandwich, isn't it? The problem isn't the budgeting, it's the ownership. Somewhere along the line, our money became their money. A mainstream fact about later life relationships. Financial abuse and control often go unnoticed because they read dressed up as concern. Statistics show that older adults are especially vulnerable when one partner handles most of the finances. You've trusted them for decades. So when they say, "I'll take care of it," you believe them. But the tone is shifting now. It's not just the questions, it's the permissions. Before you know it, you're asking whether you can buy a new coat, upgrade your phone, or sign up for that art class you've been eyeing. They never say no outright at first. They just plant the seed of doubt. Maybe wait a bit, or a test probably not worth the money. The pause becomes the gate, and they hold the keys. Experts still argue whether financial control in older couples is more about fear of dwindling resources, of medical bills, than manipulation. But here's the thing. Even if it starts as fear, it can become a habit. And habits are harder to break when they give one person more power. I once heard about a man named Gerald who, after retiring, began managing all household spending. His wife Linda was given a weekly cash allowance, just enough for groceries. If she wanted anything outside that, she had to apply for it, as if she were requesting funds from a company budget. She told me the worst part wasn't the limitation it was realizing. He stopped seeing her as an equal partner and started seeing her as a dependent. You start noticing patterns too. They check the bank account more often. They forget to tell you when a pension payment arrives. They start keeping certain envelopes in a locked desk drawer. When you ask about it, they brush you off. It's complicated. You wouldn't want to deal with it. The fridge hums in the background as you picture a small, invisible ledger in their head, your value, measured in columns of cost versus contribution. Did you bring in any income this month? No. Well, then your requests slide into the liability column. It's the same unspoken math as calling you a burden, just wrapped in numbers. You think about the times money was a shared joy, splurging on a trip, buying a ridiculous kitchen gadget you didn't need but loved. Now, every purchase feels like you're defending yourself in a trial you didn't agree to. And here's a quirky true story to lighten the sting sorta. I once met a widower who told me he used to argue with his wife about her wasteful love for scented candles. After she passed, he found a box in the attic labeled "for later." Inside were dozens of candles, each wrapped with a note about a memory they shared. He lit one every night for months. "I would have bought her twice as many if I'd known," he said. Funny how money loses its grip when the person's gone. Back at your table, you can't help but feel the weight of their gaze when you reach for your wallet. It's not about the purchase, it's about control. And control has a way of tightening until you don't notice how little space you have left to move. Experts still argue whether it is possible to reclaim financial equality in a relationship once it has been tilted this far. Some say transparency and joint decision-making can restore balance. Others warn that by the time you realize the leash is there, the knot is already too tight. The worst part, you start internalizing it. You skip coffee with a friend because you don't want to waste money. You pass by a pair of shoes you love because you can already hear the question, "Do you really need those?" And with each choice you don't make, the leash pulls a little tighter, so gently, you barely feel it anymore. It starts with one missed call you never hear about, then another. Then you realize it's been weeks since your friend Marjorie invited you over for tea, and she's never missed a Thursday in 20 years. You think maybe she's been busy until you run into her at the pharmacy and she says, "I left a message with your husband. Did he not tell you?" That's how isolation works. It doesn't slam the door shut. It just slowly closes it, until the gap is too narrow to slip through. A mainstream fact about aging and social health. Regular social interaction reduces the risk of cognitive decline and depression in older adults. Cutting someone off from friends and activities, isn't just rude, can be harmful to their mental and physical health. At first, you assume it's a misunderstanding. Maybe they forgot. But then you notice a pattern. Your spouse is suddenly the filter for your social life. Invitations go missing. People say, "Oh, I thought you were busy," when you had no idea there was an event at all. And when you bring it up, they wave it away. "I didn't think you'd want to go." or you get tired so easily. I was just looking out for you. Experts still argue whether this kind of behavior comes from overprotectiveness or deliberate control. Either way, the effect is the same. You start to disappear from your own life. Here is a quirky true story. A man named Saul in his late 70s used to be part of a community choir. His wife started telling the director he was too tired to attend rehearsals without ever asking him. Saul found out months later when a fellow choir member called to check in and realized the group thought he'd chosen to leave. By then, his spot had been given to someone else. You start noticing how small your circle has become. That monthly book club, cancelled because the weather's been bad. The neighbor who drops by with fresh muffins. She didn't look well. I told her we'd call her, except you never do. The phone rings less. The calendar looks emptier. The days stretch longer, and not in the peaceful way they used to. You remember how earlier in your marriage, your spouse would encourage you to see friends, even push you out the door when you hesitated. Now, it feels like they're subtly pulling you back inside, away from the reach of anyone else's voice. The tricky part is, it's easy to believe the excuses. Maybe the weather was bad. Maybe you would have been too tired, but then you start feeling the change in yourself. How the idea of going out feels heavier now. How you hesitate to reach out first because you're worried they'll be annoyed. Experts still argue whether this sort of slow isolation can be reversed once it takes hold. Some say yes, with deliberate effort to rebuild connections. Others warn that once a person's world shrinks enough, they may stop trying to push the walls back. The worst part, you start adapting. You spend more evenings at home, telling yourself it's cozy. You scroll through old photos instead of making new memories. And when you think about calling someone, you hear that inner voice, your spouse's voice, saying, it's probably not worth the hassle. And so you stay. The phone gathers dust. The friendships fade to holiday cards and the occasional email. The outside world becomes something you look at through the window instead of stepping into. Here's the cruel irony: social isolation, whether chosen or imposed, doesn't just affect your mood. It can weaken your immune system, mess with your sleep, and even shorten your life expectancy. That's not an overstatement. It's the kind of fact researchers repeat over and over because too many people shrug it off. But in your quiet kitchen, with the empty chair across from you, the research feels irrelevant. What matters is that your world used to be bigger. And now, someone else is holding the map. It's not always what they say, it's who they compare you to. At first, it's a passing comment over breakfast. You know, Helen from church still drives herself everywhere at 80. Then it's at the doctor's office. Mr. Reynolds walks 2 miles every morning, rain or shine. The comparisons stack like bricks. And before long, they've built a wall between you and the person you used to be in their eyes. A mainstream fact about self-esteem in later life. Older adults, who are frequently compared to younger or more capable peers, are more likely to experience anxiety and a decline in motivation. This isn't about harmless encouragement, it's about being measured against a standard you never agreed to. Experts still argue whether comparisons can ever truly be constructive in long-term relationships. Some believe they can inspire healthy change. Others point out that when they're constant, they stop motivating and start eroding. And you can feel the erosion slow, steady, like the sea pulling at the edge of a cliff. Here's a quirky, true life story that still makes me wince. A man named Albert, in his early 80s, had a wife who adored reading the newspaper aloud to him. One day she started adding, "Isn't it amazing what some people can still do at that age?" She thought it was harmless. But Albert told a friend it made him feel like he was already on the losing side of a race he didn't even want to run. You notice it too. It's never just about Helen from church or Mr. Reynolds. It's about implying that you could be better if you just tried harder, ate differently, exercised more if you were someone else entirely. You start dreading the stories they bring home, because each one is another yardstick laid against your life. Over time, the comparisons sink in. You find yourself explaining why you didn't go for a walk today, or why you didn't bake that cake from scratch. You're defending choices you never used to question, as if there's a silent scoreboard somewhere and you're always behind. The cruel part: these comparisons often come dressed as admiration for others, not criticism of you. Look at Margaret's posture, amazing, right? They say, sipping coffee. But you hear the unspoken end of the sentence. And yours isn't. Experts still argue whether people who make these comparisons are even aware of their impact. Some say it's unconscious, an ingrained way of talking about aging. Others believe it's deliberate, a way to keep you striving toward an impossible standard, so you never notice the ground shifting under your feet. It's not that you don't want to improve yourself, you do. But improvement should come from a place of love, not from standing in someone else's shadow. And lately, that shadow feels cold. Here's the thing: constant comparison doesn't just make you doubt your choices, it makes you doubt your worth. And once that doubt settles in, it starts to color how you see yourself in every other area of life. You stop celebrating the things you can do because you read too busy mourning the things you don't. You remember a time when your spouse bragged about you to others, how proud they were of your garden, your cooking, your way with people. Now, the compliments have been replaced with reminders of how someone else is doing it better. And every reminder is another chip in the surface of the bond you thought was solid. So you sit there, listening to yet another story about a neighbor's marathon or someone's new skill, and you feel the wall grow higher. You wonder if they'll ever stop building a tour, if it's meant to keep you in. It starts with a cough, or maybe a limp, something small you mention in passing while reaching for the sugar bowl. And instead of a sympathetic, "How are you feeling?" you get, "See, I told you this would happen if you didn't listen to me." Your health, your aches, your changes, your quiet worries, has suddenly become a weapon in their arsenal. A mainstream fact about elderly health: chronic conditions are common after 60. But how a partner responds to them can make a significant difference in recovery and mental well-being. Encouragement and support can lower stress hormones, while criticism or blame can have the opposite effect, prolonging symptoms and increasing anxiety. Experts still argue whether partners who health shame are acting out of concern gone wrong, or are using vulnerability as a means of control. But when you're on the receiving end, it doesn't matter which it is, it feels the same. You notice the pattern. If you skip a walk because of knee pain, it becomes, "This is why you're slowing down." If you forget something at the store, it's, "Your memory's going already." If you decline a second helping at dinner, it's, "Losing your appetite, that's not good at your age." Every natural fluctuation of the human body is reframed as proof you're failing. Here's a quirky true story that makes the point. There was a woman named Marlene who loved gardening well into her 70s. One spring, she pulled a muscle, lifting a bag of soil. Her husband turned it into a running joke. "Guess the roses are too much for you now." He told it to friends, to neighbors, even at family gatherings. It wasn't malicious in tone. But after a while, Marlene stopped gardening. She said it was because of her back. But a friend later admitted it was because she couldn't stand being the punchline anymore. Back in your own kitchen, you realize how insidious this weaponization is. It turns every conversation about your body into a tally sheet, where every ache is evidence against you. It doesn't invite solutions, it cements a narrative. You remember when talking about health together meant making plans, taking vitamins, going for swims, trying new recipes. Now, it feels like a courtroom. And you on the witness stand, defending your body's right to exist, without constant judgment. Experts still argue whether couples can unlearn this habit once it's entrenched. Some therapists believe awareness and communication can shift it back to support. Others warn that once a partner starts seeing your health as a bargaining chip, they'll keep playing it until it no longer gets a reaction. You catch yourself hesitating before mentioning that your shoulder's been sore. You downplay the stiffness in your fingers. You laugh off the shortness of breath you felt climbing the stairs. It's easier to stay silent than to hand them more evidence. And that's the real danger, when your silence starts to feel safer than their reaction. Because then, the things you don't say can grow in the dark, and by the time they come into the light, it might be too late to treat them medically or emotionally. So you sit there, swirling your tea, listening to them talk about someone they know who's still in perfect health at your age, and you nod like it doesn't sting. But inside, you know the difference between someone caring for you and someone keeping score. And once you've felt that difference, it's hard to ignore. It catches you off guard the first time, like a slap without the sting. You're at a small dinner with neighbors, telling a harmless story about forgetting where you put your reading glasses. When your spouse chimes in with, "Oh, that's nothing," tell them about the time you couldn't remember your own cousin's name. The table laughs. You laugh too, because what else can you do? But inside, something shifts. That was a private moment, one you trusted them with, and now it's a punchline. A mainstream fact about dignity in older adulthood. Public embarrassment from a partner can have lasting effects on self-esteem and even willingness to participate in social situations. The sense of being safe with someone erodes quickly when they turn you into entertainment. Experts still argue whether public put-downs are meant to be humorous, bonding, or are subtle dominance displays. Some insist it's harmless teasing. But you know the difference. You can feel it in the drop of your stomach when the words leave their mouth. it doesn't stop there. The next time you're at the store, they make a comment about how slowly you walk loud enough for the cashier to hear. At a family gathering, they bring up how you can't manage the stairs anymore, while you right there, nodding, as if you've suddenly been demoted to a case study in aging. Here, as a quirky true story I'll never forget. A man named Pete loved playing cards with friends at the senior center. One evening, his wife stopped by to pick him up, and announced to the whole table, "Don't keep him too long, he needs his naps, or he gets cranky." Everyone laughed. Pete never went back to that card game. You start to notice the tests embedded in these moments. A little jab in public to see if you'll push back. If you don't, the jabs get bolder. A comment about your driving in front of the kids. A remark about your forgetfulness at a church picnic. Each one a small chisel strike, shaping how others see you and how you see yourself. Experts still argue whether people who do this realize the long-term damage. Some think they're oblivious. Others believe they know exactly what they're doing, making themselves look sharper, more capable, at your expense. You feel it physically, how your shoulders tense when you sense they're about to speak in public. How you try to steer conversations away from personal topics, just in case they decide to share something that wasn't meant for an audience. You'll find yourself avoiding situations where you can't control the narrative. And that's the hidden cost. Public humiliation doesn't just sting in the moment. It changes your behavior going forward. You start staying quiet in groups, smiling politely while others talk. You shrink in the very spaces that used to feel like community. The next time it happens, you catch the flicker of satisfaction in their eyes as the group chuckles. And that's when you know it's not an accident anymore. It's a test you're not supposed to pass. It's subtle at first. Affection that used to be constant now shows up only in certain moments, and always when you've done something they approve of. They kiss you after you fold the laundry without being asked. They rest a hand on your shoulder after you agree to cancel lunch with a friend because they weren't feeling up to it. It feels nice in the moment, but later, you realize you've been rewarded. Like a dog given a treat for following a command. A mainstream fact about relationship health. In emotionally secure partnerships, affection is consistent, not conditional. When affection becomes tied to compliance, it's no longer connection, it's control dressed as warmth. Experts still argue whether conditional affection is always intentional, or if some people simply fall into the pattern without realizing it. But to you, the effect is clear. You can feel the difference between someone loving you because you are you, and someone loving you because you did what they wanted. It's not just physical affection, either. It's words. Compliments appear right after you've given up something for them, or when you've stayed silent in a disagreement. A sudden you read the best follows on the heels of you shelving your own plans to make theirs easier. And if you push back, if you insist on doing things your way, the affection evaporates like mist in sunlight. Here's a quirky true story from a woman named June. Her husband would only tell her he loved her when she cooked his favorite meals. If she made something different, he'd be polite but distant for the rest of the evening. Over time, she started making that same stew twice a week, not because she loved it, but because she craved those 3 little words. One day, her daughter pointed out she hadn't heard her dad say "I love you" in months, except on stew nights. That was when June realized the affection wasn't about love, it was about stew. You begin to recognize the pattern in your own home. If you spend the day on things you enjoy, reading, calling friends, tending the garden, they're cool and distracted by dinner. But if you cancel those plans to help with something they want, suddenly they're leaning in close, their voice softer, their touch lingering. Experts still argue whether this dynamic can be shifted back to healthy ground. Some therapists say that open conversations about needs and boundaries can break the cycle. Others warn that once love is used as leverage, it's difficult to make it unconditional again, without both people actively choosing to change. The danger is how quickly you adapt. You start making small choices to earn those moments of warmth, even if it means setting aside your own wants. You cancel outings before they can be criticized. You offer to do things they haven't asked for, just to see if you'll get that approving smile. And each time, you tell yourself it's because you love them, when deep down, you know it's because you're chasing the feeling of being loved. Eventually, you realize the affection isn't a steady flame anymore. It's a light switch they flip when it benefits them, and they're the only ones with the key to the breaker box. And if you've ever sat in the dark long enough, you know how desperate you can get for someone to turn the light back on. It happens in conversation so casually, you almost miss it. You're reminiscing about the trip you took to the coast, how the air smelled like salt and the gulls were bold enough to snatch fries from your hands. When your spouse interrupts, That's not how it happened. We didn't even go to the coast that year. We went to the lake. You blink, because you know they're wrong. You can see the ocean in your mind, feel the wind tugging at your sweater. But they keep going, retelling the whole story with different details, different choices, and somehow, different you. A mainstream fact about memory in older adults. It's normal for details to fade or get jumbled over time. But when one partner consistently rewrites shared experiences, it's no longer about simple forgetfulness. It's about narrative control. Experts still argue whether this is always intentional. Some chalk it up to flawed memory, others to a need to dominate the official version of events. The trouble is, when it happens often enough, you start doubting yourself. Here's a quirky true story I once heard from a man named Colin. He told me that after 40 years of marriage, his wife began correcting his stories in public. At first, it was minor dates, names, what color the wallpaper was. But over time, she started replacing entire events. One day, she told friends that she'd planned and paid for their honeymoon. Colin knew he had, down to the last train ticket. But in the moment, he just smiled and let her speak. Later, he admitted he wasn't sure anymore if he remembered it right, or if he was just holding on to his version out of stubbornness. That's the slow danger of rewritten history. The more you hear their version, the less certain you become of your own. You stop sharing stories altogether, afraid of being corrected again. And when the past becomes something you don't trust, the foundation of your life together starts to wobble. You notice it in the small things first. The year you adopted the dog, the name of the cafe where you used to meet on Fridays. Even the way they describe old arguments changes suddenly. You're the one who started them, the one who overreacted, the one who needed calming down. Experts still argue whether couples can repair trust once the shared record of their life has been tampered with. Some say yes, if there's mutual acknowledgement of what's real. Others believe that once the past is rewritten often enough, it becomes the present truth by sheer repetition. And there's an extra sting to it. To realize the rewritten stories often cast them in a better light. They're more generous, more patient, more resourceful in their versions. You're forgetful, hesitant, sometimes unreasonable. You find yourself wondering which version your friends believe, which version you're supposed to believe, which version will survive when you're both gone, and only one set of stories gets passed down. It's a strange kind of loneliness being in the same memories as someone, but in entirely different roles. And it leaves you with an uneasy question. If you can't agree on the past, how can you agree on the future? The silence isn't new. You've had quiet moments before. But this one is different. This one has edges. You can feel it in the way they walk past you without meeting your eyes. In the way the air seems to thicken between you. It's not the peaceful stillness of two people comfortable in each other's company. It's the weaponized kind. The cold shoulder as punishment. A mainstream fact about communication in long-term relationships. Healthy silence is mutual and restorative, while punitive silence, often called the silent treatment, is linked to higher stress, lower relationship satisfaction, and even physical health issues like increased blood pressure. Experts still argue whether the silent treatment is an instinctive defense mechanism or a deliberate form of control. The truth is, it can be both, but the effect is always the same. It creates distance that the other person must cross alone, often on their knees. At first you try to break it. You ask if they're okay. You bring them tea. You make small talk about the weather, the neighbor's new car, the show you both watch. You get nothing back, maybe a nod, maybe a monosyllable, but nothing that invites you in. Here's a quirky true life story from a man named Roger. His wife once gave him the silent treatment for so long after a minor disagreement about paint color that he started leaving posted notes around the house just to get basic answers. Do we have milk? What time is your appointment? He said it felt like living in a library where every book had been hollowed out. You begin to notice the pattern. The silence always follows something they didn't like, a disagreement, a decision you made without their input, even a small comment they took the wrong way. It's never about cooling down. It's about making you feel the chill until you give in. Experts still argue whether this behavior can be unlearned in relationships where it's become a habit. Some believe that with the right tools, couples can replace punitive silence with time-limited breaks for emotional regulation. Others warn that if one person finds power in withholding communication, they're unlikely to give it up voluntarily. The worst part is the mental loop it traps you in. You replay whatever you said, scanning for the exact word that set them off. You wonder how long it will last this time. You debate whether to apologize just to thaw the air, even if you don't think you did anything wrong. And slowly, You start adjusting to avoid the silence in the first place. You hold back opinions. You give them more say in decisions. You step softer in your own home. Because the absence of sound can be louder than any shout. It echoes in ways that linger long after it's over. One evening, the silence stretches into its third day, and you catch yourself whispering to the dog just to hear a voice in the room. That's when you realize, this isn't just about a lack of words. It's about erasing your presence until you feel invisible. And invisibility, once it sets in, can be hard to come back from. It slips in during the most ordinary of moments. You're pouring their coffee when they say, "You should be grateful I still make time for you." Like they've just done you a favor by sitting at the same table. Or they glance around your home and remark, "You should be thankful I've kept things together all these years." Gratitude, something that once flowed freely between you, now arrives as a demand, a reminder of what they think you owe them. A mainstream fact about healthy relationships. Genuine gratitude strengthens bonds and increases life satisfaction, especially in older couples. But when gratitude is forced or weaponized, it flips the script, turning a shared life into a ledger of debts. Experts still argue whether this behavior stems from insecurity, entitlement, or a warped idea of fairness built over decades. Whatever the cause, you can feel the imbalance. Instead of appreciation, these moments carry an undertone of, "You're lucky I haven't left." You start noticing the pattern. They highlight every effort they make, driving you to the doctor, paying a bill, cooking a meals, though it's above and beyond, instead of the mutual care you once took for granted. And in the same breath, they gloss over what you do for them, as if your contributions have become invisible. Here's a quirky true story from a woman named Clara. Her husband, after retiring, began keeping a notebook of every household task he'd completed: mowing the lawn, taking out the trash, even changing light bulbs. Whenever they argued, he'd pull it out and read from it, ending with, "You should be grateful for all this." Clara started keeping her own list, not to compete, but to prove to herself she was pulling her weight. She stopped showing it to him after realizing he didn't want equality, he wanted acknowledgement on his terms. Over time, the demand for gratitude wears you down. You begin thanking them for things you never would have before, just to keep the peace. You overcompensate, gushing over a favor, exaggerating your appreciation because you've learned that anything less risks being labeled ungrateful. Experts still argue whether couples can reset the gratitude dynamic once it's become a weapon. Some believe it's possible if both partners commit to giving without expectation. Others caution that when gratitude becomes a tool for control, it's rarely surrendered willingly. And here's the quiet danger. Eventually, you stop expecting them to be grateful for you at all. You internalize the imbalance, start to believe you should be thankful for their bare minimum, and in doing so, shrink your own sense of worth. One morning, as you thank them for passing the salt, you catch yourself. Passing the salt is not a grand act of love. And yet, here you are, handing out gratitude like it's rent on a space in your own life. That's when you feel it, the subtle, exhausting weight of living in someone else's tally book. It happens the moment you let yourself dream out loud. Maybe you're sitting on the porch, watching the evening light spill across the yard. When you say, "I've been thinking it would be nice to take a pottery class," you expect curiosity, maybe even encouragement. Instead, you get a smirk, and, at your age, "What are you going to do, open a shop?" The words land heavy, flattening that small spark before it can even flicker. A mainstream fact about aging and mental health. Pursuing new hobbies and goals in later life has been shown to improve cognitive function, boost mood, and even extend lifespan. Crushing those aspirations doesn't just bruise the ego, can rob someone of real health benefits. Experts still argue whether partners who mock late-life dreams are simply projecting their own fears or actively trying to keep the other from growing beyond them. Either way, the effect is the same. You stop sharing your ideas, not because you've run out of them, but because you're tired of watching them get stepped on. You start noticing the repetition. Mention wanting to travel somewhere new, and they say it's too expensive, too dangerous, or too much trouble. Bring up writing a memoir, and they'll joke about no one wanting to read it. Suggest volunteering, and they'll wonder aloud if you're up for the commitment. Here's a quirky true story from a man named Henry. He told his wife he wanted to learn the harmonica, something he'd dreamed of since childhood. She laughed and said, "What's next? Joining a circus?" Henry never bought the harmonica. But 2 years later, at his granddaughter's birthday, she handed him one as a gift. He picked it up, played a few shaky notes, and said it was the happiest he'd felt in years. You begin to keep your dreams private, storing them away like fragile glass that might break under the weight of their words. The porch becomes just a place to sit, not to imagine. Conversations stay within safe borders. Weather, groceries, the same shows you've watched for years. And with each unspoken idea, your world gets a little smaller. Experts still argue whether people who discourage their partner's ambitions realize the long-term damage. Some claim it's a misguided attempt to protect from disappointment. Others believe it's about control, keeping you in a familiar role. So they, have to adjust. The danger isn't just in the dreams they squash. It's in the dreams you stop having, because once you start filtering your thoughts for what's acceptable to say, your mind stops wandering beyond those limits. You trade possibility for predictability, and predictability, while safe, can be a slow form of decay. One evening, you almost mention an idea for repainting the living room. You picture the look you'll get, the chuckle, the dismissive shake of the head, so you swallow it. The words taste bitter on the way down, not because of the paint color, but because you can feel another door closing quietly inside you. It starts small, so small you almost miss it. A glance at your open notebook, a quick skim of your mail before handing it to you, a casual reach for your phone with a just checking the time excuse. Each one is small enough to shrug off, but together, there's something else. Boundary testing, a mainstream fact about autonomy in later life. Maintaining personal boundaries, both physical and emotional, is linked to higher self-esteem, better mental health, and even longer lifespan. Boundaries aren't just for the young. They're part of what keeps you feeling like yourself, no matter your age. Experts still argue whether people who test boundaries are simply unaware of the lines they recrossing, or whether they push on purpose to see what they can get away with. The danger is that the process is incremental. By the time you realize how much space they've taken, it feels awkward, even confrontational, to push back. At first, it's checking your calendar to help keep track of things. Then it's answering the phone when it's clearly for you. Later, it's commenting on what you're reading, watching, or even thinking about, turning your private life into a shared resource they control. Here's a quirky true story from a woman named Leela. Her husband started tidying up her sewing room, claiming it was for safety. One day she came home to find her private letters neatly stacked on the desk opened. When she confronted him, he said, "You have nothing to hide, right?" Leela stopped writing letters after that. She said it wasn't about the content, it was about losing the sense that some parts of her life were hers alone. You feel that same shift creeping into your own life. Your desk doesn't quite feel like yours anymore. The drawer where you keep sentimental things is suddenly reorganized. You catch them in small fibs about why they moved something, always with an innocent smile, always framed as helping. Experts still argue whether couples can re-establish boundaries once they've been eroded for years. Some say it's possible with firm, consistent communication. Others caution that if someone benefits from the erosion, more control, more access, they have little incentive to rebuild what's been taken down. The tricky part is that pushing back can feel like overreacting. It's just a phone call. You tell yourself it's just a letter. But boundaries aren't about the size of the thing, they're about the principle. And once the principle goes, everything else is up for grabs. Over time, you stop leaving your notebook open. You keep your phone closer. You find yourself locking the bathroom door even when it's not necessary. Not for privacy in the moment, but for the small comfort of knowing something is still yours to control. One afternoon, you walk into the room and find them at your desk again. They look up, smile, and say, "Just curious what you're working on." It's a harmless sentence on the surface. But in your gut, it feels like another quiet test, and you're really not sure how many you've already let them pass. It begins so subtly you can't pinpoint the first time it happened. Maybe it was when you misplaced your glasses and they said, "You're imagining things again." Or when you mentioned a conversation you'd had, and they replied, "That never happened." At first, you laugh it off. Everyone forgets things sometimes. But gradually, it stops feeling like forgetfulness and starts feeling like erosion, not of memory, but of self-trust. A mainstream fact about aging. Mild memory lapses are normal, especially under stress. But when those lapses are constantly questioned or contradicted, they can accelerate feelings of cognitive decline even when none exists. It's not just about memory. It's about confidence in your own reality. Experts still argue whether this behavior, a fan called gaslighting, is deliberate manipulation or unconscious defensiveness. Either way, it works the same. You begin to doubt what you know to be true. It shows up in small ways. You remember agreeing to meet friends at a certain time, but they insist you never told them. You recall buying something at the store, but they say you must have dreamed it. Soon, the doubt creeps in before you've even opened your mouth. Will they believe me? Or will they correct me again? Here's a quirky true story from a man named Victor. He swore he'd left his walking stick by the front door, but his wife insisted he'd taken it to the garden. After an hour of searching, they found it in the trunk of her car. She laughed and said, "Guess you're losing it faster than I thought." Victor told me it wasn't he losing the stick that upset him. It was the way the moment made him feel like a child in his own home. You start noticing your own hesitation. You double-check things before mentioning them. You prefaced your stories with, "I might be wrong, but," even when you're certain. And slowly, your confidence drains away. Experts still argue whether couples can repair trust in perception once it's been damaged. Some say it's possible, with active listening and validation. Others warn that once doubt has been sown deep enough, it becomes a permanent filter on every interaction. The cruelest part is that this erosion doesn't just affect arguments, it seeps into daily life. You start asking their opinion on things you never questioned before, like what you wore or how you cooked dinner. Not because you need their approval, but because you've begun to distrust your own. One night, you're telling a story to a friend when you feel yourself falter, wondering if you've got the details right. That's when it hits. This isn't about forgetting. It's about being trained not to trust the person you see in the mirror. It's a quiet evening, nothing remarkable. You're sitting together, the hum of the refrigerator filling the pauses. You make an offhand comment, something about maybe visiting the park tomorrow, if the weather's nice. They don't look up from what they're doing. Instead, they say it. "You're not worth the trouble anymore." The words don't land like a shout. They land like a door closing. A mainstream fact about emotional well-being in later life. Verbal affirmations and respect from a partner are strongly linked to lower rates of depression and greater life satisfaction. The absence of that respect or the presence of outright dismissal can have the opposite effect, creating isolation even in shared spaces. Experts still argue whether such statements are meant to end a relationship outright or to wound deeply enough that the other person stops expecting care. It doesn't matter which side of that debate is right. You can feel the break happen inside you in real time. You stare at them, searching for a flicker of regret, or maybe a quick, "I didn't mean it," but nothing comes. They just keep reading, scrolling, flipping the page, whatever it is they were doing before deciding to remove your worth with a single sentence. Here's a quirky true story from a woman named Jean. Her husband told her, during a fight over nothing in particular, "You're not worth the air you breathe." She didn't respond. She just stood up, walked to the bedroom, and began packing a bag. She said it was the clearest moment of her life. No confusion, no bargaining, no hope that things might change. Just a certainty that this was the last thing she would ever hear from him as his wife. In your own chair, the stillness feels strange, almost fragile. You think back to every moment we've walked through together, the cold tone, the burden remark, the money leash, the isolation, the comparisons, the health shaming, the public jabs, the affection with strings, the rewritten past, the silent treatment, the forced gratitude, the dream crushing, the boundary testing, the erosion of and you realize this sentence isn't separate from those, it's the sum of them. The final ledger entry. Experts still argue whether there's any point in confronting someone after words like these. Some say it's possible to demand accountability, to set conditions for staying. Others believe the phrase itself is the clearest sign you'll ever get that it has time to go. You don't need to argue with it. You don't need to rehearse your defense. You don't even need to wait for an apology. That may never come, because once someone tells you you're not worth the trouble, the only thing left is to decide whether you believe them or whether you finally, quietly, prove them wrong by walking away. And maybe, just maybe, this time you'll do it before the echo fades. The room is dim now. The hum of the fridge blends with the faint tick of the wall clock. You let the moment stretch, not to savor it, but to mark it in your memory the moment the decision stopped being a question. You push back your chair. The sound is louder than you expect. You stand. The wind down begins slowly, your thoughts unraveling like a long spool of soft thread. You imagine stepping outside into the cool night air, the kind that smells faintly of leaves and distant wood smoke. Your breath comes easy, not because the air is different, but because you're no longer holding it in. The sky above is quiet and endless, a canvas without edges. And for the first time in a long while, you feel your own outline again. The noise of the house is behind you now. Out here, the silence isn't sharp, it's open. The kind of silence that lets your mind stretch without bumping into walls. You take a step, then another, each one loosening the knot that's been sitting just under your ribs for years. There will be mornings ahead where you wake and reach for the familiar shape beside you and it won't be there. There will be afternoons where you catch yourself wanting to share a thought, a joke, a story, and no one answers. Those will sting, but they'll sting less than staying. Experts still argue whether leaving late in life is bravery or necessity. You decide it's both. Because the years ahead, however many they are yours, and the weight you put down tonight will not be picked up again. The night feels softer now. You tilt your head back, breathe in, and let the cool air settle around you like a blanket. The echo of their words fades, replaced by the steady rhythm of your own heartbeat. And somewhere between one step and the next, you realize you're already free. End of script. Thanks for watching the video. Please subscribe and like to support the next videos.